Critical race theory. At its core is a framework which seeks to analyze and understand from a legal perspective what are the prevailing forms and patterns of oppression in a society that are specifically based on differences in race or skin color. Racial oppression occurs when a dominant group denies some other racial group access to opportunities in employment, education, housing, and fair treatment in courts of law. Racial oppression is expressed in acts of discrimination and violence against members of the victimized group. This oppression is also rooted in the laws, policies, and the social institutions of a society and is manifested in the lived experiences of individuals that make up the victimized racial minorities. Dominance of a group does not emanate only from sheer numbers. The dominant group is the group that holds the lion's share of the political, social, and economic power that exists within a society. The proponents of CRT seek to break the cycle of racial oppression by deconstructing and dismantling the societal attitudes and behaviors that reinforce and sustain racial oppression. In their work, Critical Race Theory: An Introduction, first published in 2001, the legal scholars Richard Delgado, one of the founders of CRT, and Jean Stefanich discuss several general propositions that they claim would be accepted by many critical race theorists, despite the considerable variation of belief among members of the movement. These basic tenets of CRT, according to the authors, include the following claims. 1. Race is socially constructed, not biologically natural. 2. Racism in the United States is normal, not aberrational. It is a common, ordinary experience of most people of color. Owing to what critical race theorists call interest convergence or material determinism, legal advances or setbacks for people of color tend to serve the interests of dominant white groups. Thus, the racial hierarchy that characterizes American society may be unaffected or even reinforced by ostensible improvements in the legal status of oppressed or exploited people. 4. Members of minority groups periodically undergo differential racialization, or the attribution to them of varying sets of negative stereotypes, again, depending on the needs or interests of whites. 5. According to the thesis of intersectionality or anti-essentialism, no individual can be adequately identified by membership in a single group. An African American person, for example, may also identify as a woman, a lesbian, a feminist, a Christian, and so on. Finally, 6. The voice of color thesis holds that people of color are uniquely qualified to speak on behalf of other members of their group or groups regarding the forms and effects of racism. This consensus has led to the growth of the legal storytelling movement, which argues that the self-expressed views of victims of racism and other forms of oppression provide essential insight into the nature of the legal system. End quote. CRT is an outgrowth of critical theory, which was developed by social scientists based at the Frankfurt School in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. Critical theory is heavily influenced by the thinking of Karl Marx, and also George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Various branches of academia have borrowed heavily from critical theory. One beneficiary is the area of research that is called critical legal studies. Critical legal studies emerged in the United States in the mid-1970s. At the time that critical legal studies was being developed, it had already become apparent that the legal victories achieved by the civil rights movement in the mid-1950s had not delivered the change in the circumstances of racial minorities that had been initially expected. CRT was established after a number of lawyers left the critical legal studies movement due to their dissatisfaction with the movement for it not giving sufficient attention to issues related to racism. CRT's birth is regarded by some adherents to have occurred with the staging of the first annual workshop on critical race theory, which was held in Madison, Wisconsin on July 8, 1989. Co-founding member Mari Matsuda defines CRT as, quote, the work of progressive legal scholars of color who are attempting to develop a jurisprudence that accounts for the role of racism in American law and that work toward the elimination of racism as part of a larger goal of eliminating all forms of subordination, end quote. So why are some people stridently opposed to CRT? Critics of CRT see it as being anti-American and divisive, as it categorizes all persons in American society as falling into one of two camps, racist or anti-racist. Under CRT, anyone not considered to be actively working to dismantle the systems that support racism is seen as being a racist. Critics of CRT see that kind of reasoning as being itself a racist form of thinking. In addition, CRT also rejects certain values that are closely associated with the civil rights movement, such as colorblindness and the desirability of racial integration. This rejection is seen by some as amounting to a repudiation of the Judeo-Christian values upon which America is founded. Critics of CRT also see the theory as being anti-reality, since it presumes all whites are exploiters and that racism exists in all interactions between whites and blacks. Critics also find that CRT is far too negative in its view of the considerable progress that America has made in stamping out racial inequality. The critics of CRT point to the fact that America is the only majority white country that has elected a black man, not once but twice, to be its head of state. The most strident critics of CRT are to be found, not surprisingly, amongst the political right, including the Christian evangelical movement. Even so, some evangelical churches are embracing CRT in a sincere effort to better understand the perspectives of racial and ethnic minorities. Those few brave churches are facing harsh criticism from some influential voices on the political right and the conservative Christian movement in the United States. Critical race theory is just what its name suggests it is. It is an academic theory. As such, it is a tool that can be used to better understand the world we live in. Unfortunately, history has taught us that tools designed to accomplish noble ends have a way of being misapplied when found in the wrong hands. Here is a question for us to consider. Would Jesus be more concerned about the erroneous aspects of CRT and its potential for misuse, or would his concern be about the forces in Western societies which prompted and stimulated the emergence of CRT in the first place?